Hi, I'm Kimberly, and welcome to As I've Seen It. Last week's video became a part one during the editing process. I hadn't intended this to be a two-part thing, but I realized as I was editing that the information I had given you was a bit too shallow for where I wanted to end up. I started out talking about Dave Chappelle, and I talked about the two visits to the White House that he mentioned. One was by Frederick Douglass, and he didn't give a name for the other one, but the other one was by Booker T. Washington. But what he said at the very end of his monologue was, I'm going to give him a chance, meaning he was going to give Donald Trump a chance. And he also said, I hope he gives a chance to the historically disenfranchised people. And there has always been a resistance by the historically disenfranchised people. And part of what we think of as the civil rights movement, the roots of that movement can be found in the time period I was talking about last week, at the very beginning of the previous century. In February of 1895, the most famous African American passed away, and that was Frederick Douglass. For more than 40 years, Frederick Douglass had been the face of the opposition, the face of those who were disenfranchised. From his slave narrative, his biography that recounted the tale of how he escaped slavery, to his newspaper, the North Star, founded, I believe, in 1847, to his many trips abroad to raise funds for the abolitionist movement, to his trips to the White House to meet with Abraham Lincoln to discuss the pay for black soldiers during the Civil War, to discuss what would happen during the Reconstruction, to his advocacy for the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and his push for full enfranchisement of black men to be able to vote. He was the face of what we would call a civil rights movement during the 19th century. Now, when Frederick Douglass passed away, had it been a different century, had it been more modern, the person who might have stepped into that leadership vacuum, who people might have recognized as the leader of the nascent civil rights movement, could have been, should have been, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a journalist. To the best of my knowledge, she's the first African-American investigative journalist, female investigative journalist, and she was fearless. Ida B. Wells started her career as an educator. She was born in the 1860s, and then she quickly moved to documenting and writing about lynchings. She was raised in the South, and she not only wrote about lynchings for black newspapers, she actually put together a couple of pamphlets, a couple of groundbreaking pamphlets, because Ida didn't just write, record the numbers of lynchings and where they happened. Ida dug into the case histories. Ida dug into the sociology of lynching. She wanted to get to the bottom of why all of this violence was being perpetrated against the African American community. 70 years before Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat on a bus, Ida B. Wells was asked to give up her seat on a train. She had a ticket for the first-class women's car, but she was forced off of that car and forced to sit in the segregated smoking car. She was a civil rights pioneer. Within a year after Booker T. Washington gave his speech at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895, the Supreme Court made segregation the law of the land. What we think of as Jim Crow began in 1896. So the civil rights pushback, and the guy recognized as the leader of that, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And I understand why Du Bois became the leader of that movement in many people's eyes, because he was the guy with the PhD from Harvard, first African American to be awarded that degree. In 1903, so this would have been a couple of years after Booker T. Washington and Teddy got into such trouble for, Booker T. having dinner at the White House. Du Bois wrote a beautiful book entitled The Souls of Black Folk. As the 20th century progressed from the first decade to the second decade, the balance of power shifted from the shoulders of Booker T. Washington toward those who were considered more radical, toward those who were considered more militant. The NAACP was founded in 1909. Du Bois was a founding member. Ida B. Wells was a founding member. It was a multiracial group that founded the NAACP. And part of the reason they felt the need for this organization was because of not only the increase in the number of lynchings, but also the number of race riots. And race riots at the time, up through most of the 20th century, consisted of groups of white vigilantes going into black neighborhoods or even black towns and burning out the black residents, killing scores of people some of the times. Woodrow Wilson is remembered as the guy who shepherded the United States through World War I. What people generally don't know is that Woodrow Wilson was a Confederate. Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal workforce in Washington, D.C. Teddy Roosevelt was the first American president to invite an African American to sit down to dinner. Woodrow Wilson, to my knowledge, was the only president to have an African American thrown out of the White House. During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, the epidemic of race riots grew so much that in 1917, Du Bois and Ida B. Wells organized what's known as the Silent March. In 1917, approximately 9,000 African Americans marched through the streets of New York to the sound of nothing but drums. There were no bands, there were no cheers. They marched because race riots had gotten so bad. Under Woodrow Wilson's watch, the summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer because there were, I believe, 6 race riots, 6 massive incidents of African Americans being burned out of their homes, being lynched by mobs, killed by the scores. And remember, this is 1919, so this is after World War I. There were incidents of African American soldiers being hung in their uniforms, and Wilson did nothing. Now, the reason I bring up Wilson's administration and bring up the people who fought against Wilson is because Dave Chappelle said we should give Donald Trump a chance. And I wanted to highlight how much damage one presidency can do. I remember thinking in 2000, when Al Gore said he wasn't going to fight the election results anymore, I remember thinking, okay, 4 years, George Bush, all right, how much damage can he do? Well, we all saw how much damage he could do. He broke the Middle East. So Dave Chappelle says, give Donald Trump a chance. Well, he's already had a chance for 18 months to tell us who he is. And during that time, he's told us that Mexicans are rapists and we shouldn't let Muslims into the country, and the ones that are here should be put on a list. We've given him a chance to fill his cabinet. And who did he put into his cabinet thus far? There's Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, who was so racist he couldn't become a federal judge in the 1980s. We gave Donald Trump a chance when it came to appointing his advisors, and he appointed a white nationalist, Steve Bannon. So Donald Trump has been given multiple chances, and he's not in office yet. The historically disenfranchised have pushed back against the violations or the attempts to eliminate their civil rights for more than a century. And the historically disenfranchised will continue that under the next administration. Thanks for watching.